and anyone watching the meeting via the webcast too. To the no members in the gallery. Committee members, please be aware that when we are all on camera, you may be visible on screen when people around you are speaking, and please remember to speak clearly into the microphones. We welcome the use of the Welsh language at meetings. I have had no request for people to speak Welsh today, so this meeting will be conducted in English only. Please can all mobile phones and other noisy devices be put on silent. If there is an emergency alarm, please follow the green signs and go to the ground floor of the Civic Centre car park. Thank you. We'll start the meeting now. I'd like everyone to introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. My name's Norma Parish, and I'm standing in for the chair who isn't able to be here today. So can we go around the table and everyone introduce themselves, please?
Justine Cass, Solicitor and Interim Deputy Monitoring Officer.
Karen Mayo, Senior Business Support Officer.
Marie Williams,
John Jones, Glenavon Ward Councillor.
Gwyn Jenkins, Snatchford Ward.
Steve Evans, Upper Cumbrian Ward.
Matthew Ford, Trething Ward.
Glyn Caron, Llanrabban West.
And Nick Jones from Newin.
The other officers, please introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alison Hughes, Head of Licensing.
Claire Howells, Licensing Officer.
Thank you. We'll start the agenda items now. The first item, attendance and apologies. Are there any, Karen, apologies?
Yes, Chair, apologies received from Councillor Waite, Mills, Cathy Evans and Giles Davis.
Declarations of interest. Perhaps, Justine, you could fill us in on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. No declarations of interest have been given to me, so, Chair, there are none for today's purposes.
Thank you. Item 3, minutes of the Licensing Committee meeting held on the 27th of April. Now, I think I'm the only person that attended this meeting. Everyone else is new to the committee, so we can only note these at this present time. We can't move them. So we go on to the next item, item 4, minutes of the previous licence hearings. That's on pages 11 to 18, and it's the same with this. I was the only person present, but minutes look okay to me. I'm sure if members want to ask any questions, they can on this. If anyone has any comments or questions? No? Right, so we'll just note those. We go on to item 5, which is gambling fees, and it's on pages 19 to 32. And we go over to Alison Hughes, the licensing manager. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.
Do you want to complete the presentation and then questions, or would you like questions as you go through?
I think, as you wish. I'm happy with either. I think it might be slightly better if I make the presentation and we have the questions afterwards, simply because some questions may be answered as I go through later parts of the report.
Yes, right. Thank you, Alison.
What I'll do is I'll quickly read through the report just to precede the items that are here for the record. So if we start with the purpose of the report, it's to agree revised annual fees charged under the provision of the Gambling Act 2005. And this relates to a range of gambling premises, including betting shops, tracks, adult gaming centres, family entertainment centres and bingo premises, etc. These fees will be for the period of the 1st of August 2017 until the 31st of July 2018. We've suggested 2 recommendations for you. Firstly, that the fees and charges detailed in Appendix 1 of the report be approved from the 1st of August 2017. And secondly, that the fees are subsequently reviewed annually. To give you some background, this authority has a statutory duty under the Gambling Act to set fees for premises licences in accordance with the Gambling Premises Licence England and Wales Regulations 2007. The premises licences to which this refers will be, as I said, the betting shops, racing tracks, adult gaming centres, family entertainment centres and bingo premises. The general functions of the licensing authority in dealing with gambling premises licences, including the setting of licence fees, has been delegated to this committee under the constitution of the authority. Moving on to the issues and findings, the legislation provides that for the following types of fees to be determined by the licensing authority, and that's the licence application fee, a first annual fee, and a general annual fee, notification of change of circumstances fee, and various other fees, including applications to vary and transfer a licence. The regulations stipulate a maximum figure the local authority is permitted to charge for the licensing of these premises, and we're permitted to charge a fee based on the reasonable cost recovery up to this maximum, but not above. Where the cost of the authority exceeds the amount specified as the maximum, this cost has to be borne by the authority. We currently license 13 premises under the Gambling Act, consisting of 9 betting premises, 2 bingo premises and 2 adult gaming centres, all of whom will be required to pay an annual fee. When calculating new licence fee costs, there is a range of legislation and guidance that we have to take into account, and these include the Provision of Services Regulations 2009, and this states that any charges provided by a competent authority must be reasonable and proportionate to the cost of the procedures and formalities under that scheme, and that they must not exceed the cost of those procedures and formalities. The guidance in Open for Business, the LGA guidance on locally set fees, and the similar guidance from BIS make the same points and go into detail about how local authorities can ensure they are charging a reasonable fee. And it's also worth pointing out appropriate case law, and in particularly Hemmings versus Westminster, which is still before the courts. And that legislation and the court case has confirmed that only the administration and associated activities directly related to the licence can be charged as part of the licence fee. What that particularly means is that the cost of any investigation of unlicensed premises and other activities such as freedom of information requests relating to gambling premises, for example, cannot be included, and those costs have to be borne by the authority. As I've said, the Hemmings versus Westminster case is important, and I think the thing we do need to note is that for a small number of local authorities falling foul of this legislation have been required to refund part of their licence fees going back many years, where they've been found to be charging more than is permitted. So it's worth really getting right first time, and that's what this document is trying to do. What I've done in 5.5 is start to, in 5.6 is to start to outline the various direct and indirect costs of the administration and enforcement that can be included. And this includes implementation costs such as the developing policies and setting fees, authorisation of officers, etc. The direct staff costs, including on-costs, travel and staff training, etc. Indirect costs that support the licensing function, such as senior management, legal and HR. Also specialist equipment costs, and that includes our specialist databases that we use for this work. And any third-party costs for inspection and enforcement, which doesn't apply in the case of gambling, but will apply in other fees that are brought before you later in the year. Now, many of these costs are shared between many different types of licence and also between other activities. So, for instance, the databases are shared between a number of teams, and what we've done is we've costed those out pro rata, so that only the relevant cost is charged back to these particular licences. What we've done in terms of working out the reasonable cost recovery is worked out the licence steps and the time taken for each step. And it's worth noting that that's a real-time calculation rather than a best calculation. And by by that, what I mean is that we've worked out how long it takes in the real world with phones going, the photocopy running out of paper, etc., rather than what can be achieved in a perfect world. We've also looked at the on-costs and indirect costs, and they've been calculated by the finance team for us. And the specialist and other costs have been based on invoiced costs as appropriate. What we've then done is entered these into a specialist licence spreadsheet, which was developed by the Welsh Licensing Expert Panel. That's used across Wales and has now been adopted by the Local Government Association across the UK. Now, the costs calculated using this methodology haven't been tested yet through the courts, but we believe they are sufficiently robust to answer any legal or other concerns. And the fees and costs calculated using these calculations are shown in Appendix 3, column 3 of Appendix 1. What I've also done in column 4 is then shown the proposed fees, and some of those are, as I've said, lower than our calculated fees, where our calculated fees are higher than the maximum permitted. Looking at what this actually means, we can see that some application, transfer and variation fees have fallen significantly as a result of this calculation process. This has been for two main reasons. Firstly, that previous fees were based on the time taken to administer and enforce new legislation. And obviously, where officers are more au fait with this legislation, those processes have now become more streamlined. The second major issue has been the collaboration with Blaenau Gwent Council, which is delivering real management and other cost savings. And these are reflected then in the reduced fees that we're charging for licence holders. Looking at the fees that we can charge and the maximum fees, what we can see is that for betting and other premises, particularly in terms of the annual fees, the existing fees have gone up slightly. It is only very slight, but we've got an income change of around £477 for betting shops and £14 each for the bingo and adult gaming centres, and that's a total increase. So it is very, very minor, but it does mean that our actual income will go up slightly. Where we're losing out is perhaps on the new applications, but those aren't included in the budget anyway, because they happen so rarely. They're treated as one-off items. And what will happen on those is we're just getting less extra income than we might have under the old regime. Now, local authorities aren't obliged to charge the maximum they've calculated as the reasonable cost recovery level. A lower fee can be charged if you so choose, but the difference between this lower fee and our actual cost must be borne by the authority and cannot be recharged to other businesses. So, for example, you may wish to reduce the fee where a new fee is significantly higher than the previous fee, and it's felt that you'd rather have a step change that would be fairer to businesses. Where the fee is very high for what it is and would adversely affect small businesses, or the fee could deter businesses from becoming licensed. And I think we have to recognise that it's more cost effective to reduce fee levels and to encourage people to become licensed than to try and deal with them as unlicensed premises with all the investigation costs that cannot then be recovered. So those are the options that are available to you. You can choose to reduce the fees that we're suggesting, but we can't then recharge them to other businesses or recover them in any other way. So once you've made your decision regarding the fees and what you wish to be charged for the forthcoming year, we will then place those on the website, and we will notify any applicants from the 1st of April, so the 1st of August, getting dates from there, that the new fees will be in place. What we do also tend to do is anyone applying now will be told that the income is coming in, so that they can choose to expedite their application if they wish to, and to get it in quickly. Looking at monitoring and evaluation, what we need to do is keep this evidence for a minimum of 7 years in case of judicial review, and that has happened to some other authorities, so we'll make sure that we keep this evidence. And then in terms of the review for the following year, which we need to do this annually now, what we're going to do is review our process for setting fees and to make sure it hasn't been affected by changes in the law or guidance or case law, for example. We'll then look at the underlying data and in particularly the activity sheet for each licence to make sure that we're not spending more or less time on each activity. We'll ask finance to update the staff hourly costs and on costs. We'll look at the supporting functions such as writing policies and see how those costs have changed. And we also need to look at whether there was a significant profit or loss in the period, and particularly if we've made a profit in this year, we need to recognise that next year if that profit has been significant. This would really come in if, for example, we thought we were going to carry out a specific activity and we had not then carried out that activity. And what we'd then do is either give a refund, particularly to those premises not seeking to re-licence, or reduce the licence fee for the coming year so that it balances out. What we would then do is rework the cost calculator that we've done and then resubmit it to yourselves to have a look at the costs that we're proposing for each year. So just to conclude, as I've said, we've got a statutory duty under the Gambling Act 2005 to set fees, and that's actually explained further in the Gambling Premises Licence England and Wales Regulations 2007. The reasonable fees that we think we can charge have been calculated for the year 1st of August 2017, and these are shown in Appendix 1. And the recommendations are that you can approve those or review them as you need, and then that they will be subsequently reviewed annually. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Are there any questions? Yes, Stephen.
Have you had any complaints of, from any of the shops or the betting facilities about a slight price rise? Or I know a lot of them wouldn't because a lot of them have gone down, but you always get ones that have had slightly gone up.
We have had one gentleman in Blaenau Gwent who was applying for a variation and did comment that the fees that they were charging, which are similar to ours, were higher than for other authorities. And there was a concern that he would take that to judicial review. I believe in Torvine we've had no comments along those lines, but it's always open to do so. And I think it really shows that, particularly for regional and national organisations, which many of these are, they're going to look at our fees and think, well, that's quite high. Why is that so high? And we would then need to justify it.
Glenn?
Not so much a comment, but more of a, not so much a question, more of a comment really, but I can see why they go to judicial review. I mean, gambling is a licence to print money. They can afford to go to judicial review, and they whine about the fees they pay. I mean, it absolutely annoys me to see that some of these areas here, we cannot recoup our costs from, an industry that is basically a licence to print money, and that effectively takes money from this authority's frontline services to subsidise gambling. And I realise there's absolutely nothing we can do about it, but it does make me angry.
I think a couple of things. I think firstly the business that actually queried the fees for the other authority was actually a very local business, and one that perhaps doesn't make as much money as the national businesses do sometimes make. Interestingly, although I've said we've excluded the investigation of unlicensed premises from our calculations, there is a suggestion within the guidance that we are permitted to charge that for gambling premises. But the legislation and case law around licence fees generally don't seem to reflect that. So that's something that we'd have to look at for the future. I know that DEFRA are actually actively looking at the investigation of unlicensed premises for animal establishment licences, because they're reviewing how we charge the fees at the moment as part of new legislation that's due to come in. So I think that is something that is going to be looked at for the future. I think it's worth mentioning in the case law I've just mentioned that the fee being charged was very considerable, and it reflected the fact that the council in question did not want that type of premises there. And it was, and this is something that has been done in the past, and is being done at the moment, I think, by some authorities, where this particular case related to a sex establishment, and the view of members was they did not want that in their area, and the fees were therefore set to discourage that type of business. So they more than reflected the actual costs borne by the authority.
All of them do. I mean, if you look at some of these, the maximum fee calculation exceeds the maximum amount that we can claim, and therefore all we claim is the maximum amount. And those are the areas really I'm referring to. I mean, it isn't a huge amount of money, but the duplicate licensing fee costs £38.22, and we can only charge £25. But there are numerous examples of that through Appendix 1. And that's really what I was referring to, the fact that it costs us more for some of these areas of work than we can actually charge.
I think, regrettably, that's often the case for smaller rural authorities. Our costs are higher. We have to have people who are trained and authorised. We have to have the same database, etc. Whether we have 13 gambling premises in this case, or 130, which might be the case in one of the city centre authorities. So they do benefit from the numbers game, where that they can charge some of their own costs right the way across a larger number of licences. So I think it is a problem generally that is experienced by small rural authorities, and it's something that I know parts of the government are beginning to look at in more detail, but whether they get that through their legal teams would be an interesting point. I'm waiting to see what happens on that one.
The issue is, it's one area where we would like to make a profit because it's there to be made if we were allowed.
And I think that the difficulty I've got is that with some of the other licences that I'm due to cost, is that when I look at what I had to cost in terms of what we do and what we therefore have to charge, it's actually quite proportionally very high compared to the amount of business that they're getting in. So it isn't always fair, but it is the best mechanism that we have at the moment.
Any other questions? Application fees, the first part of Appendix 1, and then provisional statement application. They've been reduced quite substantially. Over £1,000, some of them. Well down. So, I mean, I don't think we can be accused of overcharging for these. I think it looks a good deal to me. So, any other questions or comments? No? Right. The recommendations are the fees and charges detailed in Appendix 1 of the report be approved and have effect from 1st of August 2017. That's the first part. Now, do we agree on that? Somebody move it? Seconded? Show of hands. Everybody agreed? Thank you. And the second part, the fees are subsequently reviewed annually. Thank you. Everybody agreed? Thank you very much. So that has been agreed, Alison. Thank you. We go on to the next item, which is item 6, Quarterly Licensing Committee Update. Are you doing that, Alison or Claire? Alison is. Right. What we usually do with this is members sort of interrupt as you going along, Is that okay? Because the sections are quite diverse, really. Thank you, Alison. Thank you. So if there's any questions as we're going along, please indicate to me and Alison will answer them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say that although it says report written by myself, Claire and Simone have a very significant input into this report. And you know, they do a lot of work on this to make sure that the facts and figures get to you as you want. So looking at this, this is to update yourselves on the work of the licensing team for the first quarter 2017-18. And the recommendations are that you note the activity report for the first quarter and you note and comment on any contents of the report. So look at the background. What I've done on this report, which is perhaps slightly different to previous reports, is it's broken down into operational and management matters, and I'd welcome your views on whether that's how you want the report to be made. It's just when we started looking at how many management issues we needed to report to you, it made sense to be reporting those separately, so they could all, you know, be done quite clearly and a little more in areas where you could discuss them. So looking at the operational matters first, and alcohol and entertainment. There have been 8 complaints in relation to licensed premises during this first quarter, which have included 3 noise nuisance complaints in relation to 1 premises, underage consumption of alcohol, an allegation that a licensed premises was trading outside of permitted hours, and then disorder and public nuisance. The licensing officer, which would have been Claire, passed the noise nuisance complaints to the environmental health officer for investigation, and that investigation did not progress as the licence holder made the decision to close the premises.
Alison, can I just come in there? Underage consumption of alcohol, we seem to have that all the time. I mean, the work that goes into it, I'm really surprised, really, that is it pubs or off licences, or the corner shops, you know, the off licences?
This one refers to a public house, and I know at previous meetings we've brought to your attention issues that I've discovered through late night and weekend enforcement, off licences and on licences. But I do work very hard with the licence holders. Once we do get complaints, we work together making sure that their due diligence is up to speed. So we look at what staff training they have in place, what refusals registers they have in place, and very often or not, I pass them over to our employability team who run training courses on underage sales. So again, it's another form of training where all the partners are working together to prevent this from happening. But yes, I agree, recently we are going through a spate of a number of complaints in relation to underage sales.
Thank you, Claire, for that.
Okay, so looking at the 3 complaints that were received in relation to 1 licensed premises, the complaints allege that there is regular disorder and that the licence holder is knowingly allowing the sale of alcohol to underage persons. What Claire has done is held 2 meetings with the licence holder, DPS and the police to discuss these issues and to put in place measures to prevent further issues. And Claire is continuing to work with all parties to review the actions agreed, and a review date is planned for later in July, which we'll update you on at the meeting in October. Moving on, information. Yep.
Sorry, Gwen.
Sorry. I've got to say now.
The licensed premises are closed. The licensed premises are closed.
That particular one is still open.
Oh, we'll get it in a minute. Okay. The licensed premises are closed. What would happen if the same person decided to open it back up again? Would he proceed, or...?
The complaint was passed over to our environmental health officer, and it has been agreed that that information will be kept on file for a time period agreed by the environmental health officer. So it depends if it opens and what happens, each case on an individual merit. So we'll see what happens. There's no plans for it to reopen in the near future, I've been told.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on to a case that we've previously brought to your attention as part of a licensing review in October 2016. We can update you that there have been no complaints received in this quarter in relation to those premises, but Claire has been working closely with the licence holder and the DPS to ensure compliance with the licence timings and the other conditions that were placed on by the panel. And in fact, we can now update as well to say that those premises are now for sale, aren't they? So we're looking for, hopefully that we'll have a completely new ownership of those premises, and then we'll be always working with them as well to make sure that the standards are maintained as required. Moving on, just to report that joint work by Torfaen and Blaen y Gwent is continuing and proving to be beneficial. Both teams took part in a multi-agency operation in Blaen y Gwent during this quarter, carrying out test purchasing at a licensed premises, and particularly club premises, and we have another one planned for Torfaen. The real benefit on that is that a licensing officer can go into those premises that isn't known there, because they're from the other district, and that has proved very valuable. And quite interesting, because we're finding quite a few club premises are actually selling alcohol to non-members. Looking at the other work that we've done, we've collated the information for the annual return for the Home Office, looking at all the statistical information for the year, which is quite labour intensive, and it takes a considerable amount of time to complete that. There were 2 premises that had not paid their annual fee by the last quarter. All premises have now paid, and my thanks to Claire for chasing that up. She does a lot of work on that. The other big ticket issue for this quarter has been the temporary event notices, with 91 received in this quarter, around 56 of which were for the Lions Rugby Tour.
Could I ask about that, Chair? I can see that the fee is £21, and my guess is it doesn't cover the cost of doing the tents. Is that the maximum fee we can charge, and are we considering increasing it if it's not?
So it is the maximum we can charge, yes. But on the other hand, it's income, and some income is better than no income. It is also worth noting that I and Claire went out on Saturday morning to check compliance, much to the surprise of many of the premises that we visited. We did find one that appeared to be operating without a temporary event notice, and further discussions are taking place with those premises.
Steve, you want to come in?
Yeah. With these temporary events, are we able to predict in the future when you're going to get them? Because there's usually quite a lot of sporting events, so this is going to be a regular occurrence. It's not just going to be monthly, particularly when there's, like the World Cup or the tennis, or there's going to be a lot of spikes of temporary events.
Fortunately, most sporting events take place during licensing hours, and there are therefore no particular issues. Because this was happening on the other side of the world, it was a breakfast event, and this did therefore cause us more of an issue. And what happened was that letters were sent out to all of the premises reminding them that they did have to apply for a licence, and as I said, around 56 of them did so, which was very positive. I think it's worth noting, however, that a number were phoning us a few days before the event to ask us whether they could have a temporary event notice. Now, the temporary event notice, the minimum notice is 10 days. They can apply within 5 days, but if there are then any issues, it's automatically cancelled and they won't get that. And they're only allowed a certain number of late temporary event notices. But quite a few were applying even within, in a shorter period of time than that. And one of the reasons I and Claire went out on the Saturday was that Claire was taking 3 phone calls on the Thursday regarding a temporary event notice for the Saturday. And of course that doesn't give time for environmental health and the police to respond. They have to be able to look at those applications and respond before we can issue the temporary event notice. So,
questions I was going to ask is already been asked by councillors.
I think the reason, when we said about the sporting, was we went to one early morning one. He did have a licence, and there was 8 people there. Well, because of the result injured on the last match, that's why you had an increase, wasn't it? Obvious.
Yeah, I think that quite a few of the premises actually have morning licences anyway. They already do breakfasts, so that was fine. And quite a few apply for temporary event notices, and that's fine. But yeah, it is an issue where we have sporting events outside of the normal office hours for them to operate in, but it hasn't happened that often.
What was the reason why they couldn't take money till 9? You couldn't buy anything until 9 o'clock. Like the match started at 25 to 9, is it?
Well, what's happened is they haven't applied for a temporary event notice to sell alcohol before then. They can sell alcohol before then if their premises licence permits the alcohol of sale, the sale of alcohol from 9 o'clock. That's when they're allowed to start selling alcohol. If they want to sell from 8 o'clock, they would then have to apply for a temporary event notice to allow that to happen on that day. But there are some pubs that have a premises licence from 8 a.m. and you will see, particularly for those pubs that do have a big breakfast trade, you see people in there drinking on a regular basis at that time. But what would have happened in the premises you went into was they hadn't applied for a temporary event notice. They were only selling within their licensing hours, whatever they were, but you would still have been able to obtain bacon, butties and coffee before then, just not alcohol.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so looking at moving down to 5.1.8, as you will probably be aware, but some of you anyway, the Licensing Act 2003 sets statutory fees based on non-domestic rateable value of the premises. What's happened is that the Valuation Office, which sets these rateable values, underwent a review at the end of 2016 and re-rated all premises. And the results were made available from April of this year. And it's therefore necessary for the licensing officer, i.e. Claire, to review all of the 313 licences issued to establish whether their fees were going to go up or down. It's been a lot of work, and it's estimated that the changes will result in an increase of around 1,260 in relation to the fees that we receive from those premises.
Could I just ask, you said this is labour intensive, 313 licences issued. Can I ask Claire how much pressure was on you? Because there are only 2 of you in Torfaen, and did you have any help from Blaenau Gwent for this?
Blaenau Gwent were undergoing the same process at the same time. So it has been a labour-intensive task, because obviously I have my day job to do as well as evening and weekend enforcement. But we got through it.
Thank you for all the hard work you do, because I know you are under a lot of pressure a lot of the time.
Thank you, and your comments are much appreciated.
Okay, so moving on to the Hackney and private hire licensing. We can report there have been 14 taxi-related complaints during this quarter relating to various matters, including the non-arrival of taxis, overcharging, racist or inappropriate conversations with customers, smoking and refusing to take disabled fares. Most of these have been resolved informally. The complaint of racist or inappropriate conversation with a customer were dealt with via a delegated decision report to the Chief Officer, and I've covered that further below in the delegated decision section. One complaint was in relation to an allegation that an operator was refusing to accept a booking from a lady specifically because she was disabled. And this complaint may have serious implications onto the Disability Discrimination Act, and it's currently still being investigated by the licensing officer. In fact, I can report that she's spoken to the company concerned and to the lady who had the concerns, and there is now some question of whether she needed a fully disabled taxi or whether she could cope with an ordinary taxi. And that affects the way that we would deal with that. And I'm going to come on to the Equalities Act in a minute, which will give you some more information on that.
Can I ask a question, please? Do we have specialist information for the general public for taxis providing services for disabled people? Because I've not been seen anything around.
I'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay, thanks, Alison.
6 of the complaints we received were of a similar nature regarding a private hire operator, and these are under more detailed investigation. We'll give you an update at the October meeting regarding that investigation. I can report that the licensing officer has carried out taxi enforcement in evenings in partnership with the police, and also arranged a joint operation to cover the Blaenau Gwent and Torfaen areas. A total of 12 vehicles were stopped altogether, none of which were found to have any defects, and no vehicles were taken off the road. And that demonstrates the high standards achieved within Torfaen in relation to the mechanical safety of vehicles, but I think it also demonstrates the value of having us out there on a regular basis so that the trade know that we're looking and that we're checking, and it also helps set a level playing field for the trade, that they know they're not going to be undercut by other people not achieving that same standard. Now, moving on to Section 167 of the Equalities Act 2010. This is, I've put quite a bit of information in here for you, because this is going to be a big piece of work for us in the next quarter, which we will be needing to report back to you on in October. The section that came into force on the 6th of April 2017 states that local authorities may maintain a list of designated vehicles. That is a list of wheelchair-accessible Hackney carriage and private hire vehicles. The introduction of this list is strongly recommended by the Secretary of State, and in fact we've already had one quite detailed freedom of information request on this by somebody who was concerned about the provision of taxis for disabled people. Now, the drivers of any listed vehicle must adhere to the following duties, which are to carry the passenger while in the wheelchair, not to make any additional charge for doing so. If the passenger chooses to sit in a passenger seat, to then carry the wheelchair, to take such steps as are reasonably necessary to ensure that the passenger is carried in safety and in reasonable comfort, and to give the passenger such mobility assistance as is reasonably required. It's a criminal offence if a driver of a designated wheelchair accessible vehicle fails to comply with the duties I've just outlined, and they could be prosecuted and liable to a level 3 fine, which is currently £1,000. The consequence of being on the list is that the driver must undertake those duties unless awarded an exemption by the local authority, and that would be on the grounds of medical grounds or because their physical condition makes it impossible or unreasonably difficult for them to comply with the duties. And for instance, we'd be looking at somebody who had perhaps a serious back problem and couldn't lift a wheelchair, might then ask for an exemption. But it would have to be a significant issue, and we would be looking for medical guidance on, the application of that exemption. What we're looking to do is to send a letter out to affected vehicle owners and to private hire operators, etc., advising them of the changes. And then asking, them for their comments before they're put on that list. It is worth commenting that we do have a number of private hire and Hackney carriage vehicles that are accessible by the disabled. A decision was made a number of years ago that we wouldn't prohibit new or Hackney carriage licences or limit the number of Hackney carriage licences. Because there was a lot of work to do that. But what was done was it was agreed that any new Hackney carriages applying now would have to be a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So we do have a few of the newer Hackney carriage plates that are, it is the wheelchair accessible vehicles that are plated. We also have a number that are licensed as private hire vehicles, and they do a lot of work for schools and for social services. So they're licensed, but they do contract work, and they do. We do have some that carry out those functions, but also they can operate generally as a private hire vehicle and take bookings, etc.
Are these lists of Hackney carriages suitable for disabled available to all the local parish and community councils?
What would normally happen, and what happens at the moment, is if a disabled person rings up, we would have a discussion with that person about the vehicles that are out there that suits their needs.
Okay, thank you.
So we don't just have a straight list of that's the vehicle, that's the operator. We'd actually give a much more tailored response.
Stephen, you want to come in?
On the private hire one for school children, are you aware that everybody's got with the DBS checks on these operators? Or
if they're licensed as a private hire vehicle, then all drivers of that vehicle will have to have those checks carried out, and that would be done by ourselves. The issue that the school contracts have is that some of the pickups are done by larger public service vehicles, which we don't have responsibility to licence, and where no such checks are carried out on the drivers. And what I'm aware of is that as part of the school contract, they require that check to be carried out on the driver. So they're requiring it as part of the contract.
A lot of these vehicles are seatbelt safety certificate checks. Do you actually check that?
And that's all checked as part of our licensing regime.
Right, Nicholas, you want to come in?
I think it's worth noting for those who are new to this is that actually we have all of our vehicles tested twice a year at one of our nominated garages. We also do a number of inspections. I've just mentioned the one that was done in an evening. Everything that the police saw, they stopped, a check was carried out, and they would be looking, and our licensing officer would then be looking at the the safety of that vehicle, tyres, whether the seat belts are working and things like that. So they're checked formally by our garage twice a year, and they're checked in the interim by officers.
Okay, Nicholas.
It's again, it's a question which is related around this section 167. Again, being new to this, it's perhaps a question that other people might know. This Act relates to section 165. What is the general duty of taxi drivers with regards to disabled people?
It's actually included in our licensing policy that they must give assistance. So what we've done is we've brought the previous provisions of the Equalities Act into our licensing policy. The difference now is that we are being strongly encouraged to produce a list and to require any drivers of vehicles on that list to apply for an exemption if they're unable to fully comply with the requirements of that legislation.
You did have a pack, did you, Nicholas?
Yes.
With training, yeah, it's in that pack. Yes, yeah. Gwyn?
Yeah. Do I need to declare an interest here? Because I am a PSV operator, and you did fetch the fact out there was a PSV on about the PSV vehicles. I am a PSV operator. Okay.
I could, because my brother's got minibuses, and I'm a fitter as well, so we're
Right, okay.
But I am PSV, mine, not taxi.
Right. Would there be any interest for Gwyn to declare?
No, not in this matter. I wouldn't say it's personal. It's certainly not prejudicial.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the gambling, gaming and lotteries. The licensing officer, Claire, is now in receipt of the local risk assessment policies for all of the premises that we have. And the next stage is for Claire to review each policy to ensure that the premises have taken into account the local area as per the legislative requirements to have such a policy in place. I think that we are looking at risk assessments, but also the impact that these premises do have on the local area. And I know that there is some work ongoing with the Housing Department and others at the moment to take that forward and to make sure that we're aware of how these actually impact on local people. The next item is just to comment that we've been working to review the application fees, but that was the subject of the previous report to yourself. It's also worth noting that Claire has put in a lot of time on that. It is a very complex process with quite a large spreadsheet to be populated and to be updated every time new information comes in that affects the way that we charge. Claire's also collated information for the annual return to the Gambling Commission, and again, it's a legislative requirement that we report back on the premises that we deal with. Are we okay on that one? Marvellous. Smoking in enclosed places. Just to note that there's been one smoking complaint which resulted in a fixed penalty notice being issued to a taxi driver. Obviously, we do continue to look at premises. What we do is we go, whenever we go to licensed premises, we look at the smoking issues as well as everything else. And when we see taxis out and about, we look to see whether they're smoking. And so do other officers from other teams. They've been very good at reporting what they've seen and giving us the evidence needed to take action where required.
Stephen?
How do we fare off with these vapor ones? Because you seem to see a lot of people smoking them vapes, you know. So that's the same sort of thing, but it's still, you know, you still see drivers using it.
I believe it's been brought up at previous committees, and when we review our taxi policy, it will be taken into consideration.
I think that the e-vape is a big issue because whenever we see somebody driving, that's what they're claiming to be smoking. So it is something that we will need to take into account. I just wasn't quite sure where we'd got to with that on other legislation, because I know the Welsh Office and others are looking at legislating. Just wanted to check where we were with that. In terms of street trading, there's been one complaint relating to an unlicensed trader. That trader was advised to cease trading and has done so. On charity collections, we've had no complaints in this quarter, and likewise for scrap metal. For animal establishment licensing, we've had one complaint alleging dead fish in a pet shop, which I visited, and there was nothing of concern to be found. And just to update you on the Green Meadow Community Farm, we're still negotiating with the Welsh Office and DEFRA regarding a full or partial dispensation. What has now been achieved is we've managed to get in all the information that they've requested, and I'm just waiting now for a response from them.
It's not necessary for this report. This report is all about noting the activity within the department, but thank you very much. It is appreciated. The councillor was asking whether he needed to declare an interest, and I've dealt with that matter.
I think that might be the case for a number of members, considering that this is a council-owned and run premises. It's quite a significant thing for the farm because zoo licensing is expensive simply because of the amount of work that's involved. And if we can get dispensation for them, for example, from the need to be inspected by 3 DEFRA vets as part of their licence application, anything that we can do along those lines is going to be valuable to them, particularly as they're not operating as a zoo. They're operating as a community farm that has just been brought in. It's just been caught by the zoo licensing legislation because they've got a few animals there that are covered by the zoo licensing legislation. But I can tell you what, I mean, it's things like there's a deer that's covered. There's one rhea, possibly with more, was that the? when you consider that we are actually farmed animals for part of it. And we've now got some daegu coming in, which are large, furry animals, along the lines of, say, a large rabbit. And a lot of the work that's done by zoos and a lot of the enforcement I have to take part in is around conservation. But daegu are actually banned for import by a number of countries who regard them as a major pest if they get into the wild. So these are animals that, there is no conservation issue. They're farmed animals, they're common in the wild. Some of them you don't want to let them into the wild because they breed so quickly and spread so quickly. So a lot of the requirements around the zoo licensing are just not applicable. So moving on from there, looking at some of the things that support the operational matters. Looking at service requests, we've had 44 general service requests for informational advice, for example. 10 of these were freedom of information requests, and one of those resulted in there was a request for an internal review, where the interim monitoring officer and assistant chief legal officer had to look at the response that we had made and judge whether that had been adequate. And in fact, it was judged to have been in compliance with the Freedom of Information Act. And in fact, that Freedom of Information request and review did relate to the Equalities Act and taxis and whether we had that list in place. Look at delegated decisions. There have been 2 in this quarter. One related to inappropriate comments made by a customer, made to a customer by a taxi driver, and that was a taxi driver was giving a lot of chit chat, but of an inappropriate nature to a teenager, and that resulted in a warning letter. The second referred to the removal of the caveat regarding drugs testing, so that the person would effectively be required to take a drugs test prior to any new application being reviewed. So the person had previous dealings with that person who would now be required to take a drugs test if they wish to come back on board as a taxi driver. Looking at licensing panel hearings, there's been 1 panel hearing in this quarter, and that related to a late application for renewal in respect of Hackney carriage vehicle. And there have been no prosecutions in this quarter. So that completes the operational matters. We just catch up on whether there are any comments or queries or anything that we need to clarify for you on those.
Everybody okay with that? We'll move on.
So moving on to management matters then, which really underpin the operational work that we do. Reporting first on the Constitution, we're currently looking at the Torfaen and Blanagwent constitutions to see whether any changes are required. We do recognise that what we do and how we do it will differ between authorities. We're not looking to bring them together at this stage. We have identified a few potential areas of change which will go through for legal approval, and if there's anything significant we would come back to yourselves then for you to approve that before it became part of the Constitution. Looking at the policies, we're reviewing 3 policies for the taxi, street trading and scrap metal at the moment. We're also looking to develop 2 new policies for sex shops and charity collections, and that work is continuing. The process for consultation has now been agreed, and we've had meetings with the comms teams for both authorities, and we're going to be putting that work out for consultation shortly to ensure effective stakeholder participation. And this is an essential part of the work that we're doing because other local authorities have been judicially reviewed where effective stakeholder has failed to take place. I know that there's something in particular that our legal officer has advised on to make sure that we're getting that right and we're not subject to any queries or judicial reviews at a later date.
Glenn, you want to come in?
Yeah. Sex shops were mentioned in our, but so I can understand why we're doing a new policy around that area. But I was just a little surprised to the development of 2 new policies on charity. The one is obviously charity collections. Do we have no policy on charity collections at the moment?
We don't have policies in place for either of these at the moment. We have a number of charity collections, which are your street collections and your house-to-house collections. We have a procedure that we follow for these, but we thought it would be useful to ratify those into a policy so that anybody applying for a street collection or house-to-house permit will know how we make our decisions, and anybody affected by them or annoyed by having too many would be able to come back and actually see how we use our powers as well. In terms of the sex establishments, which are sex shops, sex cinemas and sex entertainment premises such as lap dancing clubs, we don't have any. We haven't had any applications for a number of years, but our view is receiving a controversial application isn't the time to start making a decision about how we want to deal with those. So we're going to do that up front and in a reasoned manner when we're all can look at it quite calmly, so that we're ready should anything come in the future.
Could I come back on the charity collections? One of the bugbears that I have concerning charity collections is my area is a no-call calling control zone, and those charity collectors coming, it's not so bad this time of year, but in the winter they're coming at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening in the dark, frightening the elderly people in the houses or the flats to death. So, when we do that policy, can we consider the issues around no-call calling zones so that, they have to call between the hours of daylight or something along those lines?
I think that's certainly worth considering. It is, however, worth noting that we don't control all of the charity collections going on in our area. Certain of the larger national charities do not have to apply for our permission. Moving on then, just to report that a detailed review of fees is underway. We finished the gambling because, as I mentioned, we had an issue in Blaenau Gwent with somebody who wanted to make an application for which he thought we were charging too much, and it was worth doing both authorities at the same time so that we could bounce ideas off one another. But we now need to look at all the rest of our fees that we are responsible for setting. I've started with the licensing officers the review of taxi fees first, because we need to consult and we need to advertise those fees prior to implementation. Once we've got those kick-started, we'll start to look at all the rest. I'm hopeful that I will have that report to you for the October meeting, but it is a lot of work to do before then. So it may be delayed, but the sooner we can get this sorted and to you, the sooner we can get any new fee structure in place. So we will be working on that timescale as far as possible. Moving on then to the Immigration Act, we've been reporting on this for the last couple of meetings as various aspects of the Licensing Act were affected, and previous to that, the taxi legislation. The section applying to premises licence under the Licensing Act came into force on the 6th of April. And applying for holding a licence to sell alcohol or late night refreshment is now conditional on not breaching immigration laws, including employing illegal workers. And this requires the authority to make immigration checks on certain new applicants, but it doesn't affect existing licensees. We do receive queries from immigration. We've had 2 so far, relating to 5 premises, some of which did not hold a licence, but they're requesting information regarding the ownership of those premises so they can have a look at them. Then, the last issue that we've got under the Immigration Act is that following concerns expressed by members of this committee, and in consultation with the licensing, with the legal team. We are now completing a Home Office check and obtaining a certificate of good contact from the home country, where a standard DBS check will not reveal sufficient history. So we are now carrying out that work that you've requested us to do. It's anticipated that these additional checks will apply to renewals for currently licensed drivers and on new driver applications. Moving on to the collaboration, this is continuing to move forward, and we're working together and carrying out enforcement visits, etc. We're doing joint investigations, and we're also jointly working on policy reviews and on fees. We're also working to streamline both authorities' computer databases to ensure that we're recording work in the same way. And I think it's just proving simpler for us to try and work together and in the same way wherever possible. But there will still be differences in what we do and how we do it. Moving on to complaints, I've put this on now as a new item for report to committee, as I think you'd be interested to hear about any formal complaints received concerning the licensing team, but I'm pleased to report there have been no formal complaints about the team in this quarter. The last item then to look at is the licensing team performance, and just to say that it's attached as Appendix A. I think that we are down on some of the proactive inspections, etc. I think that's been the result of the fact that we've had a high number of complaints, and there are some more detailed investigations going on around those complaints, and also the fact that we've had to do things like statistical returns and other work like that. That has taken a chunk out of our time for this quarter. So looking at the action to be taken, we're just going to just say that the suggestions and directions of the committee will be followed by officers, and we will continue to review our operating procedures and policies to make sure we deliver the best service to the public. Just to conclude then is to say that the licensing team have completed a range of work in the first quarter, including inspections, dealing with complaints and taking enforcement action as outlined in the report and in Appendix 1. And the recommendations are that you note the activity report for the first quarter, and that you note and comment on the contents of this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was a very comprehensive report. You went into a lot of detail, and we're grateful for that. We didn't have to ask the questions. You were preempting them, really, and explaining everything. No, that was excellent. Perhaps members want to look at the figures, because it's the first quarter, so you've got nothing to sort of compare it with. But we can see, alcohol and entertainment, premises visited 19, that's a lot, and smoking. 25 premises were inspected for smoking. Yeah, that's a large amount, really, in 3 months. It's a lot of work. The complaints received, you can see 14, private hire and taxi. Next page, if there's nothing anybody wants to ask questions about. Representations to licensing applications received, that was low. Licence hearings, no, that was low. Service improvement plan measures. You can see there's a lot of work already done. Any questions from members?
Just one, if I could. I also sit on audit committee, and in audit they always set more work than they can possibly do, so that if there are opportunities and things go well, they can do more. Is it your intention that when these annual totals come up on the on sheet, I'm looking at page 43 particularly, is it your intention that there will be at the end of the year 100% in all of those boxes, except where obviously things like something hasn't come forward and there's a nil in there because there isn't any, but is it your intention to have 100% in every one of those boxes?
If we look at the service improvement plan measures, is that what you're referring to on page 43? Yes. This is the main team work plan for the year. What we're proposing to do is to bring a report to yourselves in September, October, that actually helps set this plan and the priorities. This is then reported via the Finon system, so that our Chief Officer will be reporting on this on a regular basis to see what we're achieving and why. And what it means is that if we're not getting 100% of these targets, we have to explain why. For some of them, they'll be over 100% because we'll be doing more work than we'd planned. But for others, there may be, for instance, that, and I think particularly for some of the things like, licensed street traders, for example, we're saying we're going to do 80% of a total of 21. But if that suddenly decreases and we have a lot less street trading going on, we then would then have, less work that we'd be doing. On that particular one, that's why we've put it that we do 80%, but it might be 80% of less. So it may be that there are changes in the trade or new legislation coming in or new guidance that changes the way that we do it and would then change these figures. But the other issue is that if we have a lot of high priority work, for example, a major investigation that is going to lead to a prosecution, it's a very, very serious case, that might actually mean that we're not able to do some of the other work. And what we then do is prioritise as best we can to see, what's the least important stuff that we can drop off the end. But if everything works as we hope it works, then everything should be 100% by the end of the year.
Any other questions? If you go through the figures, it's very clear how many visits and the amount of work the licensing officers do. On page 45, alcohol and entertainment application, you can see the tens, 91. That's an enormous amount. I know it was the rugby probably, but we get sporting events and other events, throughout the year, so it could peak like that at any time. Is there anything on any of the pages? No? Right. So, as Alison said, the recommendations are the committee note the activity report for the first quarter and that the committee note and comment. So there's no other comments or questions.
Could I just come in here and say we actually have a correction on page 45, which is the change and removal of the DPS. It reads 0 for the quarter, but in fact there was 16. 16 for the change removal of the GPS. And what that means is that on the alcohol and entertainment applications, we in fact received 132 for this quarter.
Right, thank you, Alison, for that. 132 is an enormous amount, really. Well, I'd like to thank you, Alison, and pass on the committee's congratulations to the licensing officers for the way they are handling themselves, because they're a very small complement of, staff, really, and they do an enormous job, and we are grateful for that. And it's good to see that we're working with Blaenau Gwent. That's working out, and it is to an advantage. It's an advantage to us. It's obviously an advantage to Blaenau Gwent. So thank you for that. Is there any member wishing to comment on anything?
Yeah, the second one just
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure all the committee agree with that. So if that's all then, I'll close the meeting and thank you all for your attendance.
there.